Hello, Year 13. Today we're going to be looking at an amazing text, an absolute seminal post-war American text. Last time we looked at Graham Greene in The Destructors, a very British text. This time we're traveling across the Atlantic to the United States to a book written by D. Salinger in 1951 called The Catcher in the Rye, which really broke new ground. And in this screencast, I'm going to explain to you why it was such an influential text and how it fitted in with things like film and noir, which championed the notion that society was corrupt and which tended to be very sympathetic to young people, especially young men. And one of the phenomenon that we're going to look at in the 1950s in literature on both sides of the Atlantic is the idea of the angry young man. And that's why the focus of today's lesson will be to analyze the nature of Holden. He's the main protagonist in A Catcher in the Rye, how he dislikes the fake adult world, how he sees the adult world as an artificial place where people act, where people play roles. And he contrasts this with what he sees as a more natural, more realistic, more spontaneous world of childhood. Now, the questions that we're going to look at in particular are: what form does rebellion take in the early post-war years of America, in particular the late 40s and early 50s? We're going to look at why do young people often feel the adult world is hypocritical and artificial. And we're also going to look at, in terms of AO2 form, how there's a new naturalistic speaking voice, how this voice is used in American literature, and specifically in the novel form. Now, The Catcher in the Rye, as I said, is considered an absolute 20th century classic for a whole variety of reasons. For many people, Holden Caulfield speaks as a generation, as a new emerging young generation who look back at the post-war period with a sense of disgust and revulsion. But at the same time, they're not particularly optimistic, as you'll see when you actually read Holden Caulfield. In fact, many readers find him quite a repulsive young man because he's certainly very angry, embittered, and he expresses himself with quite a lot of rage, using swear words, expletives, and continual criticism. Salinger himself is a very interesting man. He was a lifelong recluse. He barely ever went out in public. He hid himself, partly because he was a very complicated man. As you can see from his background, his father was Jewish, his mother was Catholic, so very mixed in terms of culture and religion. And he's recognized as one of the most popular and influential authors of American fiction. But as I said, he was never really in the public eye. He didn't give interviews, and he really lived as a hermit in many ways. So even though he was so influential, he was a kind of invisible, authorial figure. Now, The Catcher in the Rye, as I said, was published in 1951. Eventually, it sold over 65 million copies worldwide, which makes it one of the biggest selling novels of the 20th century. But despite its popular success, the critical response to The Catcher in the Rye was very slow at first, and it's a very complicated history. Many people dislike the book intensely. It's very graphic about sex and vulgar language. And when we think back to 1951, we still need to remember that there was quite a lot of censorship, whether that was formal or informal censorship. Despite this, Time magazine described it as one of the great novels of the 20th century. And even if you don't feel that it's a great novel when you start to read sections of it, it's an incredibly influential one. And Holden Caulfield's voice is going to echo throughout the post-war period. The story itself is of a teenager who's expelled from his high school. It's a very elite private school, and it concerns his journey across New York City in the 1950s. The issues discussed in the book include school, teachers, music, sex, alcohol, hypocrisy, family, and being a teenager. This idea of being a teenager is going to be an absolute key theme for us, because we're going to be looking at youth culture emerging, and in particular, youth subcultures that emerge. I'm going to link this to some movements like rock and roll and to teddy boys, etc. So the story is of 16-year-old Holden Caulfield leaving, and most of it is set in New York City, and it kind of describes his alienation and his loneliness. Now, Holden is really a sketch, as I say, of a teenager in the post-war years. And I've said nearly all readers identify with see some aspects of themselves or their friends reflected in different aspects of Holden's character. Younger readers tend to see a Holden Caulfield as a bit of what they are, while older readers might look back and see a younger version of themselves in Holden. And the key themes are conformity versus resistance, very, very interesting theme, identity formation, how one becomes an individual, how one remains a unique individual. And this is perhaps the greatest theme of all, perceptions of truth, an idea of truth of the individual versus the fiction and the lies of the masses. And it deals with something that we're going to talk a lot about in this course, this idea of the generation gap, which of course is not a new idea in the 1950s. I'm going to suggest that it's a question of extent. It becomes such a pronounced break with earlier generations. This is an illustration from Holden Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye, and it concerns the idea that the catcher in the wheat field, in the rye field, I should say, is there to stop children moving into adulthood. He's there to catch them and to stop them becoming phony adults, as Holden calls them. Now, it's a first-person limited narration. We only see things through Holden's eyes. You, the psychoanalyst and the reader, are spoken to directly by Holden Caulfield. It isn't a very linear plot. Much of it is stream of consciousness. There are many directions as Holden recalls things from school and from his youth. And it's all written in dialect. It's the dialect of a teenage boy, and this is why many readers and many critics liked it. They felt as though Salinger captured this new emerging youth language in a great deal of detail. David Lodge, the famous novelist and literary critic, refers to Holden as being written in what he calls skaz. Skaz is a Russian word suggesting jazz and scat. And it's this vocabulary and syntax of colloquial speech, of everyday speech, that gives the book this kind of sense, this quality of authenticity, of being directly in contact with a young person's mind. It's very spontaneous rather than constructed or crafted. It doesn't feel like a beautiful novel by a great modernist novelist at all. It's much more like listening to a young person spontaneously talk about their experiences. And as I say, it has this powerful sense of authenticity and sincerity. Interestingly enough, Ernest Hemingway, one of the great novelists of the 20th century, he wrote that all modern American literature comes from one book, and that's Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Huckleberry Finn is a wonderful, wonderful story, and it concerns the life of a young boy who's a bit of an outcast. He comes from a poor family, and much of the story is told from Huckleberry Finn's point of view. It's a naive voice, but there's a great deal of wisdom in his voice, more wisdom than he realizes. And as he narrates about his experiences, the impression that the reader gets is that in many ways he's deeper, more thoughtful, more philosophical, and more in touch with nature and himself than the adult world. And I think in the case of A Catcher in the Rye, Ernest Hemingway is right, that Huckleberry Finn's voice comes through in A Catcher in the Rye. But the difference is that when Mark Twain wrote in the 19th century, Huckleberry Finn has got quite a confident and quite a positive outlook on life. He loves nature. He's in touch with things like fishing. I'm going to suggest, though, that Holden Caulfield, on the other hand, is much angrier, much more embittered, and much more disassociated from the natural world. This actually links to a lot of popular films that were coming out in the 1950s. On the left side of my screen here, we have Marlon Brando, and this is him starring in a film called The Wild One, about a young motorbike guy who gets in trouble with the law and confronts adult society. And actually what this film shows is that he's rather naive and well-intentioned, and that the adult world is actually crueler than him. On your right here, you have James Dean, another huge star from the 1950s. And in this film, Rebel Without a Cause, once again, we see an angry young man struggling to articulate why he feels so upset. Many viewers at the time saw it as very nihilistic, as though they were anarchic figures. But in both these films, the films treat the protagonists very sympathetically. And I'm going to link them to some European philosophy, which it seems like a bit of a jump, but hopefully I'll be able to explain to you why it's so interesting. This man here is Jean-Paul Sartre, and he was one of the great French philosophers in the post-war period. He didn't invent a philosophy called existentialism, but he was one of the more influential proponents of existentialism. Existentialism is quite a difficult philosophy, so I'm going to simplify it as much as possible. What existentialists believe is that we are free to make choices. Whether we recognize it or not, in our lives, it is our duty. In fact, it is our nature to have to make choices. We cannot escape from this freedom, even if we want to. For instance, Sartre argues that the colonized people in an empire, even though they are suffering from some form of dictatorship, they still have choices, whether that's to resist or to counterattack. So all the time, existentialism is insisting that even though individuals are limited, we are still free to make choices. When we realize this, we suffer what existentialists call anguish. We know that we have to make a choice. Now, the link to Catcher in the Rye is that this is something that Holden recognizes. He sees the world as dictatorial, as pushing down on him, and he resists regardless of the consequences. Now, the political context in the 1950s is an interesting one because we have Eisenhower as president. Before that, we have Nixon. And what's interesting about this is we have the beginnings of the Cold War, of America becoming highly militarized, very anti-Russia. And we also have the McCarthy investigations when socialists and communists were persecuted. And there's a perception that men in gray flannel suits, anonymous men who work for the system, control the government and society. It was a world of expansion and social complacency. And the young black people and women had very little power in this particular society, and their voice of protest was muted. They were silenced very often. It seemed to many people in the 1950s that things would go on in the same way, and there was a sense of futility and anger. This is the society in which Holden Caulfield lives, and he speaks for this generation. He rails against phoniness, but he feels incapable of changing it. And this is why I said that the voice, although recognizably similar to Huckleberry Finn in the sense of being quite oppositional to the adult world, is a much angrier and more despairing kind of voice than we see earlier. And it also links to an amazing genre of films, which we call film noir. The idea that you're watched, the idea that there are powers out there that are controlling you, that almost breeds a kind of paranoia. In fact, film noir is defined as a genre of cinematography that's marked by a mood of pessimism, fatalism, and menace. It was originally a French word, but this genre of movies moved to America, where people like Orson Welles, Fritz Lang, and Billy Wilder made many highly successful films. And they were characterized by an angry protagonist who resists, fights the system, but is ultimately in the grip of the system and feels pessimistic about any chance of change.